of the best known versions of the story of Dracula are obviously the original novel by Bram Stoker, Dracula, the 1931 movie starring Bela Lugosi, the 1958 movie Dracula or Horror of Dracula starring Christopher Lee, and the 1992 movie Bram Stoker's Dracula starring Gary Oldman. Between these four versions, I was a bit surprised to realise that my favourite representation of the female characters in this story, Mina and Lucy, is the original novel from 1897, not any of the movies, including the one from the 1990s. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover all sorts of things relating to the weird and the spooky, and to myth, legend and folklore in general. And in this video I am going to compare these four versions of the story of Dracula and think about which one I like best and why. This is pretty much the opposite of my turn of the screw video, where I liked everything except the original. In this case, I think the novel is, of these four, my favourite. Just as a quick warning, there will be spoilers. I know you probably already know the story of Dracula, but if you're not familiar with the novel, there are some characters that often don't make it into other adaptations. They're in the 1992 one, even that doesn't have all of them. So it is possible to be spoiled if you don't know the novel or any of the slightly more faithful, use that word loosely, adaptations. Basically, there will be spoilers. I will be talking about who lives, who dies, and exactly what happens. So just be warned, spoilers ahead if you are spoiler sensitive. I want to start by thinking about the history of the vampire in folklore in particular, which was a big inspiration to Bram Stoker. Nowadays, Dracula itself is like the ur-text for vampires, and most vampire literature from the 20th century and onwards is heavily influenced by Stoker's Dracula, even if it's in a sense of trying to go against Stoker's Dracula, even if it's upending or reversing elements of Stoker's Dracula. It's impossible to get away from the influence of Dracula, at least since the 1920s. Dracula was not the first literary vampire. Famously, John Polidori wrote a story called The Vampire on the same night that Mary Shelley first started writing Frankenstein, when the two of them and Byron and I think Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley's husband, were all together in a villa in Italy during a storm and decided to write ghost stories. And I think it's really interesting, by the way, that both Polidori's Vampire and Shelley's Frankenstein started out with a prompt to write a ghost story. I'll probably do a video on that at some point, because I think we probably don't think of either of them as ghosts, especially Frankenstein's monster. But anyway, point for another day. There was also a novella called Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which featured female homoerotic vampires. This was a big influence on Stoker and on his development of his vampire, and probably also on his representation of his female characters, which I found really engaging and surprisingly not annoying, even though it was written by a well-off man in the 1890s. In the book, Dr. Van Helsing claims that vampires go all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. I've actually done a video on why I actually don't think that's the case. You can find that linked in the description. I did a video on the ancient Greek Lamia, who does drink blood, but is in other ways very different from what we think of as a vampire. The modern meaning of the word in English, as it is generally used, is a corpse that physically leaves its graves and drinks the blood of living people to sustain itself. The word and the modern idea of what a vampire is comes from Eastern European folklore that was then much talked about in Western European texts from about the 18th century onwards. The Slavic vukodlak, which now means vampire, had at one point meant werewolf. The Romanian virkolak had meant vampire or werewolf, but now means an abandoned, unbaptized infant spirit. Katharina Wilson has suggested that the word vampire came into use in French, English, German, and Latin. This is via the Catholic Church, whose official language is Latin, referring to the folklore of Poland, Russia, and Macedonia, and to a vampire epidemic that apparently occurred in Serbia between 1725 and 1732. And she suggests that in the Slavic languages before that, the word used was variations of upir, so Polish upior, Ukrainian upir. In Greece, you get the virkulakas, which leave their graves and sometimes drink blood, but do various other things as well. Apologies if I've mispronounced any of those words. Vampire folklore is primarily oral up until the 18th century. In 1718, in the Peace of Passarowitz peace treaty, Serbia and Wallachia were taken over by Austria, and occupying forces were there until 1739, and they started paying attention to corpses that were being exhumed and killed again in the area. There's a great book by Paul Barber called Vampires, Burial and Death, Folklore and Reality, which goes over these early reports of people re-killing corpses and some of the things that people saw happen, including blood coming out of the corpse when they drive a stake through it. The stake is supposed to pin it to the ground and stop it from coming out of the grave. That's why it's a stake. After the movies, and especially after Buffy, which I've spent many hours of my life watching, we have an image of these little wooden stakes, but originally it would be like a big stake. The purpose of it is to pin the corpse into the ground. Anyway, Paul Barber talks about how the decomposition of human bodies was not all that well understood scientifically in this period, but people could observe certain things happening with some corpses, and it depends partly on the geology, on the earth that you're buried in, which is partly why these stories come up in particular geographical areas, because it's to do with the conditions of the burial, whether or not some of this stuff happens. So corpses looking like they haven't decomposed as much as people think they should have done, blood trickling and appearing from bits of the corpse. And then the other factor, of course, is plague. Anytime there is an infectious illness that gets around, because one of the other core aspects of vampire folklore is that vampires turn other people into vampires. So they often come attached to stories relating to plague and epidemics, because somebody dies and their corpse looks a bit weird, and then somebody else dies and their corpse looks a bit weird, and you get stories of vampires. I'm not going to go into it in masses of detail now, but I definitely recommend Paul Barber's book for more on that. So through the 18th century, we then start to get philosophers and scientists and scholars who are interested in this phenomenon that's being reported from Eastern Europe, along with this folklore that comes with it. So you've got the phenomena of corpses doing weird things and people re-killing already dead people because they're worried that they are walking at night as vampires, and you've got the folklore of vampires, and it's all coming together, and then it is being reported on by people like Augustin Calmet. Calmet was an 18th century French monk and abbot who wrote, among other things, Dissertation sur les apparitions des anges, des démons et des esprits et sur les revenants de vampires de Hongrie, de Bohème, de Moravie et de Silésie, which is dissertations on the apparitions of angels, demons and spirits, and the revenants and vampires of Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia. In this text, he reported on vampires as a new phenomenon, certainly newly known to French theology anyway. Western travellers were writing letters or memoirs reporting vampire stories from Eastern Europe from the late 17th century and sending these home. And we have reports from officers of the law on the exhumations as well. And there are 18th century poems on the vampire too. Goethe's Die Braut von Corinth, Robert Southey's 1801 poem Thalaba the Destroyer, and of course Polidori's The Vampire from 1816, which was inspired by a poem and fragment of a novel by Byron. All of this influenced Stoker in his writing of Dracula. He researched the folklore and the stories around vampires quite extensively. He never visited Romania or Transylvania, but he did do a lot of book research, and he did spend a lot of time in Whitby. So the descriptions of Whitby in northern England, where Dracula's ship lands, are very accurate. Of the character of Dracula himself, Stoker does have Van Helsing research the man behind the vampire in the novel, and Van Helsing gets in touch with a friend of his, who is somebody called Arminius from Budapest University, who, according to the notes on my copy, was a real person. Arminius van Berry, a philologist and traveller who was Professor of Oriental Languages at Budapest until 1905. He informs Van Helsing that he thinks the vampire is the Prince Dracula who won his name against the Turk over the great river on the very frontier of Turkeyland. I apologise, every time Stoker wrote Turkeyland. The country of Turkey's name doesn't make me laugh, although I don't believe that's their own name for their country. Turkeyland sounds slightly odd. Anyway, that's pretty much all Stoker says. Usually, these days, he is associated with Vlad III, or Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was Prince of Wallachia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, I'm really sorry. 3 times between 1448 and 1476 or 77. He was the second son of Vlad Dracul, so Dracul is a Romanian noble name. It also has associations with dragon and possibly with devil as well. There are several princes of Romania called Vlad Dracul. The Impaler is the third. He is the one most often associated with Dracula because of the kind of bloodthirstiness that gave him his name, and because he fought against the Turks, which is the detail that Stoker mentions. But Stoker doesn't go into too much detail, and Stoker's knowledge and understanding of Eastern European history and geography and peoples is decent, but iffy. It's all from book learning, and he knew a lot, and he describes it very convincingly, but he did get some stuff wrong. So we don't want to get too kind of concerned with looking for a specific historical Dracula, really. I noticed he also seemed to be quite interested in accent and dialect. He has random characters crop up who are from London, from Yorkshire, from Scotland, and they all have distinctive accents and dialects written into the novel. Bram Stoker himself was Irish. He was Protestant and fairly well off at a time when Ireland was part of the British Empire, though he was in favour of Home Rule for Ireland. He would have grown up hearing a wide variety of accents. The representation of religion in Dracula is quite interesting as well, because it feels very Catholic in some ways. There's a lot of crucifixes, there's use of communion wafers as a weapon against vampires, and yet, like Stoker himself, all of his characters would presumably be Protestant. They are well-off English people and a Dutchman. They could be Catholic, but they're much more likely to be Protestant in this time period. Stoker grew up Protestant, but presumably surrounded by Catholics, which is possibly why his representation of Christianity is not specific to any denomination and has a sort of a Catholic feel to it, even though he and his characters are all Protestant. With the exception, of course, of the Eastern European characters who would be Orthodox. So, a quick plot summary of the novel. You might be fairly familiar with the basic plot of Dracula already, but as a reminder, a young solicitor called Jonathan Harker is sent to Transylvania, to the home of Count Dracula, because Dracula has bought a property in England called Carfax Abbey, and Harker is sorting out the sale. The local villagers all seem rather frightened of Dracula and his home. There's all sorts of mysterious goings-on. Harker eventually realises that Dracula is some kind of monster. He sees him crawling down the wall, like Spider-Man. He is assaulted by Dracula's 3 brides. I don't think the book actually names them as such. I'd have to check. But anyway, these 3 women assault Harker, and they want to kiss his throat. Then Dracula feeds them a baby, which is horrifying. Harker realises he's being kept prisoner in the castle. Dracula is having him write home with things that aren't true. Basically, he realises that he is in a lot of trouble. Dracula heads off to England. He has to sleep in his native soil, so he has loads and loads and loads of coffins full of the earth of Transylvania shipped with him. And he has himself also shipped in one of these coffins off to England on a ship called the Demeter. Harker manages to escape and is nursed back to health by some nuns in Eastern Europe, in Budapest. Dracula kills everybody on the ship. The captain ties himself to the steering wheel before he dies, and the ship limps into port at Whitby. A young woman called Lucy Westenra is prone to sleepwalking, and one night she sleepwalks right out of the house and goes up to a cliff at Whitby. She's followed and brought home by her friend Mina, but Dracula has clearly got to her at some point before Mina was able to find her. And from that point on, he is able to enter Lucy's home. Vampires can only enter a home if they have been invited. Dracula can take the form of a bat or a wolf or all sorts of a mist as well. He's extremely powerful in this book, or at least at night he's extremely powerful. And Dracula slowly drains Lucy of her blood. He visits her repeatedly. This goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Mina eventually hears from the nuns who are looking after Jonathan and travels out to Budapest to rescue him, to bring him home, and they get married while they're out in Budapest. But meanwhile, Lucy gets worse and worse. Lucy has 3 men who are in love with her. She is engaged to one of them, Arthur, who is the heir to a lordship. She has also been proposed to by a Texan called Quincy Morris and by a doctor called John Seward, who runs a local mental hospital and asylum. As Lucy gets more and more ill, Seward is caring for her, and he calls on his old teacher, a Dutchman called Dr. Van Helsing, to come and help him. Van Helsing is a metaphysician as well as a doctor. He is very interested in all sorts of things. He's a true philosopher. And Van Helsing slowly realises what is happening, which is that Lucy is being attacked by a vampire. Meanwhile, one of Seward's patients in the asylum, Renfield, is also under the lure of the vampire. Renfield is trying to gain eternal life by eating other animals. And the vampire is promising him all sorts of things and repeating this phrase, "the blood is the life." Lucy, unfortunately, eventually dies, despite all 4 men giving her blood transfusions and the 2 doctors desperately trying to save her, partly because her mother, who they keep not telling anything to because her mother has a heart condition and they don't want to give her a heart attack, her mother gets rid of all the garlic flowers that the doctor has placed, and there's also a telegram that doesn't get delivered. So poor Lucy eventually dies. And Van Helsing has to tell the others that she has now become a vampire herself and is preying on children around Hampstead Heath. They have to go and stake her, put a stake through her heart and cut her head off, which they eventually do once Van Helsing has shown Seward and the other men. And it's a long novel. The pacing is, I think it's better paced than a lot of 19th century novels, but the pacing is still relatively slow. So Van Helsing shows Seward Lucy as a vampire attacking local children first, and then they come back with Quincy and Arthur. And most screen adaptations very sensibly just make this one event. Arthur stakes her as her fiancé, and Van Helsing cuts her head off, and that's the end of poor Lucy. Mina and Jonathan have meanwhile arrived back, and Mina and Van Helsing get in touch with each other and start swapping notes on the vampire because, of course, Dracula is still out there. So they start tracking down Dracula, working out what he is, what's going on, and they go through this process of getting rid of all the coffins full of Transylvanian earth that he has put in various places around London, because they need to get rid of all of his possible places of rest before killing him. Meanwhile, Mina unfortunately leaves the window open at night, and Dracula is able to get in and start getting to her. So Mina starts taking on vampiric qualities, but she is still alive. After the other 4 catch Dracula in the act with Mina, he flees and Dracula takes ship back to his home in Transylvania, and they chase him there. This goes on for absolutely ages. It takes quite a while going over all the details of how they track him down and work out where he is. This involves a psychic connection he has with Mina, where she can be hypnotized at sunrise and sunset and have a mental connection with Dracula, so they can work out he's on a boat, basically. It's quite long, and it goes into lots and lots of detail, but it all ultimately culminates in a chase scene where Dracula is then confronted by all 6 of them. Van Helsing has already disposed of the brides, and all 6 of them confront Dracula. Jonathan cuts his throat. Quincy stabs him, although unfortunately Quincy has been mortally wounded by Dracula's human servants, and Dracula dies. Mina is saved and all signs of vampirism are gone. She has had a scar on her head from where a communion wafer was touched to her head because she was a vampire that then scarred and turned into a red scar, and that disappears when Dracula dies. There's then a very brief epilogue 7 years later that notes that Mina and Jonathan Harker have a son who is named after all of their friends but predominantly Quincy, although he was born a year later. So there is no implication that the baby has anything to do with Dracula or any of the other men or anything. The baby would have been conceived after this whole adventure because he's born a year after Quincy and Dracula's death. Arthur and John Seward are also happily married, doesn't really mention to whom. And Van Helsing is hanging around and bouncing their child on his knee, and everyone's living happily ever after. Van Helsing just casually mentions at one point that he has a wife who is mentally ill and who he therefore is unable to divorce, and he can't remarry. This is, of course, the situation of Rochester in the famous Gothic but not supernatural novel Jane Eyre. Presumably Van Helsing has not locked his wife in the attic, although one would imagine she's in an asylum since she never shows up. But he does mention that at one point, that he is not available romantically because he can't divorce her, she's not of sound mind, but she is still alive, and therefore he is forced into involuntary, not exactly celibacy, he's married, but singleness as a lifestyle, really. I was really surprised how modern the novel felt. Having read Turn of the Screw not long ago, which I didn't enjoy, although I do like the screen versions, Turn of the Screw was also written in the 1890s and it felt like it. The narrator is mostly a female character, but she's so snobby, and she herself is famously an unreliable narrator, and her kind of buttoned up attitude to class and sexuality, and all very typical of the time, but didn't make her very likeable as a character to me anyway. It also, the pacing feels better in Dracula, although it is very long, and it is a slow burn. Poor Lucy doesn't half take forever to die. I kept expecting Lucy to die and she wasn't dead yet. It is slow. But it does feel better paced. It was serialised by an American publication after it was initially published, but it was published as a complete novel, as opposed to lots of the works of Charles Dickens and Turn of the Screw, things that were published chapter by chapter. With those, you can kind of feel the serialisation in the writing, whereas although this is a slow development, it is a continuous development, and although the pacing is slow, it does just feel more modern. The characters feel really modern, and the plot, I kept being reminded of action-adventure movies from the 90s, because what a lot of the screen adaptations miss about Dracula is it is an ensemble story about a group of people. Various different adaptations take different characters as their lead, and one of the reasons that they are able to do that is because there is no lead character in Dracula. I suspect if you went through it, the narrative voice who takes up the most space is probably the Doctor, John Seward. His character narrates enormous amounts of this story. This is an epistolary novel, so it's written in the form of letters and also newspaper reports and telegrams and diaries. It's found footage, basically. It is the 19th century equivalent of found footage. And that was a pretty common structure for a novel. Jane Austen originally drafted Pride and Prejudice as an epistolary novel where the story is told through letters between people. I remember studying Pride and Prejudice for, was it GCSE or A level, one or the other, and our teacher had us count how many letters there are in Pride and Prejudice because the number of letters in the current novel is an indication of its origins as an epistolary novel. Anyway, so Dracula is also an epistolary novel, but that does make it also feel, because it's horror, like found footage, but just in written form. And Stoker was obviously really interested in scientific and technological developments because he really enjoys having as many different types of record as possible. He has kind of stuff at the end about how Mina's typing it all up, and so it's ending up in a typed manuscript, and they've lost the original, they've burned the originals. But these things are all originally recorded, there's phonograph diaries where Seward keeps his diary by dictating it to a phonograph rather than writing it down. Mina writes in shorthand and then she types things up. There's handwritten letters from Lucy and from Jonathan and various other people. Jonathan keeps a diary by hand. There's newspaper reports, there's the captain's log from the ship, the Demeter, that brings Dracula to Whitby, and telegrams are in there as well. So we hear the perspective of loads of different characters across the story. Van Helsing we start to hear a little bit toward the end. Mostly Van Helsing is a bit more of an outsider. His speech is heavily accented because his native language is not English, because he's Dutch, and he clearly knows more than the other characters, although he's not sure. Van Helsing in the novel is not a vampire expert. He's a doctor and a philosopher with wide-ranging interests, and as Lucy becomes more and more ill, it's Van Helsing who knows a bit about vampire folklore, enough to work out what's going on because of his wide general knowledge. It's not so much that he is obsessed with vampires already, or that he already knows loads about vampires. Toward the end, we do start to hear Van Helsing's voice and he starts to narrate sections. Most of it is narrated by John Seward, the Doctor, Jonathan Harker in his diary, Mina in her diary. And that is the vast majority of the novel. And there are some characters we never hear from. I don't think any section is narrated by Quincy Morris, like a telegram maybe. And that's it. And the same for Arthur Holmwood, Lucy's fiancé. He doesn't get really a narrative voice. Renfield doesn't have a narrative voice. So there's variation. Not all the characters are represented equally. If you had to choose a protagonist, it would be one of Mina, Jonathan and John Seward, I think. Really, none of those three stand out more than the other. And if you really had to pick one, then ultimately it's Mina's life who is saved at the end. So I guess the protagonist is Mina. And this group all come together in this ensemble to take down Dracula, and they all bring quite specific skills to the group. Mina is the one who types everything up, and by doing so, that's more important than it sounds probably, that allows them to go over all the information. Obviously, we are in the 1890s and they can't just go and look it up. They have encyclopedias, but those don't include information about vampires, so they don't have anywhere they can just go and look this stuff up. They have to put all the information together, and Mina types everything up and puts it all together for everybody, which is incredibly valuable. She's the one who puts Jonathan in touch with Van Helsing and the other three. She's the one who brings them all together. Van Helsing is the one who has done more research into vampires and who has his friend at the University of Budapest and who is able to do, he's the scholar basically, he does the research. He's also the one who is willing to say this is a vampire earlier than the others, who have to watch Lucy feed off the blood of a child in front of them before they will believe it. Or in case of Jonathan, he's attacked by Dracula and his brides himself. Quincy is the muscle. There was a line where they said they needed some Winchesters, as in the guns, to fight off Dracula's human servants, if not Dracula himself. And all I could think of was Supernatural. I was like, well, yeah, you don't want to go vampire hunting without a Winchester. Anyway. But Quincy is kind of the muscle. He is the physically strongest. John Seward obviously is the Doctor, so one of the reasons so much of the novel is narrated by John Seward is he is the one treating not only Renfield but Lucy, and he is trying to understand the medical condition that's put itself in front of him, and he has the medical knowledge. Jonathan Harker is the solicitor who has sold Dracula his home in England and who has also been to Castle Dracula. So Harker knows the geography, he knows how to get around, where the houses are and that kind of thing. And Arthur, later Lord Godalming, is the money. Mina specifically mentions at the end that they could not possibly track Dracula down to his home in Transylvania without a lot of money, and Arthur is providing that. It reminds me of why I loved the X-Men movies when I was younger. It's the idea of all these people with different kind of qualities and skills and so on coming together to fight the bad guy. They even form a kind of typical 90s team-up. You don't have a token person of colour, instead you have a token not British person, because you have the Dutch Van Helsing, everyone else is English, and then you've got the token girl, which is Mina, and that reminded me of all those movies I watched growing up in the 90s where there'd be one person of colour, usually a black person, one woman, those would very rarely overlap, and that would be your team-up. But it does feel very modern, and although it's full of gothic horror and descriptions of blood bubbling out of the mouths as you stake the vampires and so on, of course, it is the, gothic horror novel, it's also very interested in science and in investigation. This is being written around the same time as the stories of Sherlock Holmes. This is decades after Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote both kind of gothic supernatural horror, but also wrote detective stories. Edgar Allan Poe didn't tend to mix them. That's what's unusual about Dracula, is that it's a combination. But it is clearly drawing on a lot of those influences, as well as things like the phonograph. It's very interested in things like blood transfusions, which had been around for a few decades by that point. They had started being used person to person much earlier in the 19th century. They're still relatively new technology, everyone's still a little bit suspicious of them. They also get very excited by modern transport. Dracula has to take a ship to get back to Transylvania, and the others are able to chase him. They can get there in 3 days. It takes him 3 weeks because they'll be able to just take the Orient Express right on over there. The modern technology of the train. So one of the things that Stoker is clearly fascinated by is modern science and technology and modern methods of defeating this centuries-old vampire. And that's easy to lose sight of when you're reading it many, many years later, and 1897 itself feels old. And it's a period setting now. But to Stoker, this is a very modern story about using modern things to defeat an ancient evil. And the other thing that makes it feel really modern is Stoker's writing of Lucy, and especially Mina. Because I'm not saying the book isn't sexist, there's lots of sexism in there, mostly coming from Van Helsing, so you could argue that is a character trait rather than a quality of the writer or the novel. But it is fascinating how not sexist it comes across, that Mina and Lucy are very active characters, especially Mina, obviously. Lucy is a victim, really. She's very unfortunate. She is sweet and lovable. She's pretty rich, which probably doesn't hurt, but she is very, very sweet and friendly and lovable. This very nice person who has 4 men totally in love with her, because Van Helsing admits that he has developed feelings for her after coming over to treat her, as well as the 3 men who proposed to her. Everybody is in love with Lucy because she's just such a nice person. And then she is, unfortunately, falls victim to Dracula simply because of her sleepwalking, and because her mother doesn't know not to remove the garlic flowers. Mina is a very active character. Mina is one of the people who take down Dracula. There's a scene where they all hold hands around a table, vowing to take Dracula down, and Mina is part of that. At the end, she jumps out with Van Helsing with weapons to stop the coach that's carrying Dracula's coffin back towards the castle. She is involved with that. And there is a whole section where they try and keep her out of it because she's a weak and feeble woman. The men decide that it would be better if Mina had no further part in this, and they're not going to tell her anything, and that's it. And she's really annoyed, but she puts up with it because it's 1897. And then they're like, oh, Mina looks really pale today. I can't imagine what could have happened. And you want to scream at them. And it just reminded me, again, of superhero movies. It reminded me of flipping Spider-Man movies when I was younger, where apparently it's always better to not tell the girl. In fact, never mind when I was younger. The most recent Spider-Man movie did this again. It is apparently better for the female love interest not to know. And he's going to make that decision for her. This trope drives me absolutely up a wall. And it is in Dracula, but it's meant to drive you up a wall. Because in Dracula, it goes horribly wrong, and the idiots don't notice poor Mina being vampirized in front of their eyes. So they're trying to keep her out of it. And they realise that isn't going to work, and they have to include her. They then have to not tell her stuff a bit later because she has a psychic link with Dracula, which is a different issue. But they realised that it was a mistake. They realised they were wrong to keep her out of it, that they shouldn't have done that. And Mina is such an active character. Another important aspect of Mina and Lucy's characters in the book is they are victims of Dracula, and they are clearly unwilling. The book has this difference between when somebody is kind of waking and conscious and a kind of a trance state, or maybe a vampiric state they get into at night, which happens with Mina towards the end. The whole thing is set up as very much about a fight for somebody's soul. One of the reasons that they go and stake Lucy, other than to stop her from killing any children because she's preying on small children in the area, the other reason is to save her soul. And every time a vampire is staked, there's a description of an expression of peace coming over their face, including Dracula and all his brides, and Lucy. In the case of Dracula and his brides, because they're so old, their bodies then crumble into dust. Interestingly, that is meant to be an indication in the book that they're centuries old and that their bodies would have decomposed, whereas Lucy doesn't crumble into dust because she's died much more recently. But all of them get this expression of peace, and they want to save their soul. Van Helsing talks about how the fact that Lucy died in a trance is significant as well. The fact that Dracula first came to her when she was sleepwalking, when she was unconscious. And when Lucy is sick and when she is dying, there's a moment where she tears the garlic flowers off herself, but she does it when she has become overpowered by Dracula. She's gone into this kind of vampiric trance. When she's awake and conscious in the daytime and is herself, she keeps them on the way the doctors told her. And the issue of sensuality is really interesting as well, because there is a sensuality to it. There certainly is to the assault on Jonathan by the brides. There is clear sensuality in that scene, in that description. They are clearly attacking him in a sexual way. And then later with Lucy, there is a moment before she dies where she suddenly seems a bit wide. I don't think Stoker uses the word lustful, but that's the implication. She wants to kiss Arthur. But then it's revealed later that the kiss, like with the brides and Jonathan, would actually be a bite. She wants to turn Arthur into a vampire. We see this separation of the living conscious woman who is not unsexual. Her and Arthur kiss, they are engaged. Mina is married halfway through the novel, and Van Helsing alludes to the fact that she might be pregnant at one point. It's the 19th century, didn't say so in so many words, but that's why they want to protect her. It's one of the reasons, is that she is a newlywed bride and therefore might be pregnant, and that's partly why they try and keep her out of it. But anyway, it's not that they have to be completely asexual, but their sexuality is more contained in a Victorian way when they are awake. And then after Lucy is turned into a vampire, when they confront her in vampire form in the tomb, Seward is narrating, it's John Seward's diary, and he says, "It was Lucy Westerner, but yet how changed. The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness." And then Lucy calls to her fiancé, Arthur. She advanced, and with a languorous, voluptuous grace said, "Come to me, Arthur, leave these others and come to me. My arms are hungry for you. Come and we can rest together. Come, my husband, come." So there is sexuality and sensuality, and that is an aspect of the novel. Lucy wants Arthur. She wants her own fiancé, more than any kind of emphasis on sensuality between her and Dracula. But it is certainly there. However, all of the encounters are clearly non-consensual, and any time that Lucy or Mina express any kind of desire, vampiric desire for blood or sensuality or whatever, they're always in some kind of trance. They're always under the power of the vampire. And it is very, very clear throughout that Lucy is in love with Arthur and Mina is in love with Jonathan, and that does not change. Neither of them, when awake and conscious and themselves, feel any attraction toward Dracula. Mina, several times after Dracula has forced her to drink his blood, calls herself unclean because she's horrified at her own actions. They can be entranced. but once out of the trance, they do not feel any level of attraction. And the aim is to save their souls. In Mina's case, they're able to save her life as well, but in Lucy's case, although she dies, they are able to save her soul, because her face returns to peace after they stake her, and her soul can then go on to heaven rather than being trapped in this vampiric body. And the vampire is implied to not be that soul. And I know it's easy to kind of retroactively put Buffy's ideas onto Dracula, because that was a major thing in Buffy, is that when somebody is turned into a vampire, they lose their soul, and the soul is no longer existing in that person. And Dracula's not quite as specific as that, but that there is a clear implication that when they are behaving as a vampire, that is not the person's soul, but the person's soul is like trapped by the vampire. And then when the vampire is staked, the soul is released and can then go to heaven. Dracula has been adapted for the screen more than any other character except for Sherlock Holmes. I'm assuming that this includes even Jesus. I will have to check, but basically there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of reinterpretations of Dracula. If this video does well, I can keep going with versions of Dracula for years. For today, I chose 3 that I think are the most famous, the best known. I also chose the 1992 one partly because it was the first one I saw and it was my introduction to the story. I think it is also one of the best known ones. And then obviously Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee as Dracula are kind of the famous Draculas of the screen. Of course, they are all predated by Nosferatu, which was an unofficial adaptation of Dracula, but I am going to give Nosferatu its own video. At some point in the autumn, I want to have a look at different versions of Nosferatu, which is itself a version of the story of Dracula, although they tried to change things to avoid being sued unsuccessfully. They got sued anyway. Unlike Nosferatu, the 1931 film Dracula is not silent. It is a talkie. It's from the 30s, so it's black and white, but it is speaking film. It was adapted from a stage play. You can kind of see its stage play origins in the limited number of characters, the limited number of locations. Most screen adaptations do reduce the number of locations, with the exception of the 92 one, or I don't know, some of the TV series probably have more locations. The shorter films tend to reduce the number of locations from the book. Again, the book has this feel of an action-adventure movie. Sometimes it feels like a James Bond movie because everybody's just popping all over Europe. I swear the rapidity with which Van Helsing travels between Amsterdam and London in the book just doesn't quite make sense, and everybody's just all over the place. But anyway, this has much more limited cast and locations because it was originally adapted from a stage play, and it is an early film as well, so a lot of it's being filmed on backlots and so on. The plot is basically the same, but has been majorly streamlined, and with it the characters have been massively reduced. This is the big difference with these screen versions, that they are not ensemble pieces, they choose a protagonist. In this case, the protagonist is kind of Dracula himself. He's the character that we follow. Renfield isn't really quite a protagonist, and nor is really Van Helsing, although they both come close. Really, this movie is interested in Dracula himself and his impact on the people around him. And like many screen adaptations, it's also more interested in Dracula than I think the book is, even though the book is called Dracula. Its working title was The Undead, which would also cover Lucy and Mina towards the end. Of course, the book is interested in Dracula, but the book is much more interested in the living characters. And the book is, in some ways, a love story. It's a love story about the love these characters feel for each other, particularly the love that most of the men and Mina feel for Lucy, and then the love that they all feel for Mina. And it is very much about love, but about love between the living, not between the living and the undead. That's the difference with a lot of the later versions. In this case, the story is about Dracula as antagonist and various people who run afoul of him. In this version, it is not Jonathan Harker who goes to Transylvania to do the conveyancing for Dracula to buy Carfax Abbey. It's Renfield, So Renfield in the book is already a patient in a mental hospital, and he is already interested in eating animals and prolonging life, and Dracula is able to manipulate him and kind of make it worse. Whereas in this version, he is driven to mental instability by Dracula, and Dracula uses him as his servant. Dracula in the book either just does business with people like he does with Jonathan initially, and Jonathan's boss, Mr. Hawkins, who gets killed off halfway through so that Jonathan and Mina can inherit everything, by the way. That happens to like 3 different older generation characters to make sure that our heroes are alone in their little ensemble by the end. Lucy's mother, Jonathan's boss, and Arthur's father all get killed off so that they have lots of money and lots of freedom. Renfield here is being used by Dracula instead of his various servants. Mostly Romany gypsies are depicted as the people kind of doing Dracula's bidding, although I think through fear rather than anything else in the book, and then he does business with various people in London. Renfield here is his servant. And then they travel to England, oddly enough, on a ship called Vesta instead of Demeter, which is a different Greco-Roman goddess. Demeter is the Greek goddess of fertility. She's also the goddess who rescues her daughter Persephone from the underworld, or sort of half rescues her. Zeus sorts out this arrangement where Persephone will spend 6 months here in the underworld and 6 months a year in the above world. But Demeter goes to the underworld looking for her daughter Persephone, who's been abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld. And I think that's probably got a lot to do with why Stoker chose Demeter as the name for the ship that brings Dracula to Whitby Abbey. For some reason, the films renamed it to Vesta, which is the Roman version of the Greek goddess Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and the goddess Vesta, also goddess of the hearth, in Roman religion, was very, very important in Roman religion. Some of the oldest temples in Rome, the temple to Vesta, where the hearth fire is kept burning, the eternal flame of the fire of Vesta is kept burning by the Vestal Virgins. So Vesta is a very, very important goddess in Roman religion. But quite why they've renamed the Demeter the Vesta, I'm not quite sure. And then they reach England, and Renfield is here the only living person aboard the ship, as opposed to everybody being dead in the book. And he is sent to a mental hospital, and this is where we bring in Dr. Seward. And here we have a much reduced cast of characters with different relationships. So here, Seward is Mina's father. John Harker is her fiancé. As in the book, but obviously playing a completely different role because he's not the one who's been to Transylvania. And Lucy Weston is a family friend. And then there is no Quincy or Arthur. I also want to note here that this is actually not a period story. I think it gets mistaken for one because it's a long time after 1931 by now, and a lot of the men's clothes look pretty similar. Dracula is, of course, in rather old-fashioned clothing because he's a vampire, as are his brides. But if you look at the scenes set in London, the women in London are wearing clothes that were up to date for 1931. They're wearing very 20s style little cloche hats. Their skirt length is slightly shorter. It's 1931, so the style looks more 20s than 30s. But this is a contemporary story. It's not set in the past. It's easy to think it is because everybody's wearing evening wear all the time. But it's not. This one is, as far as we can tell, set in 1931. It's later that most screen versions of this story become set in the 1890s when the novel was written, rather than in their own time. Not all, but quite a lot. Lucy's role in this one is a lot smaller. She expresses an interest in Count Dracula. Count Dracula, as played by Bela Lugosi, is of course handsome from the beginning and very suave and sophisticated. In the book, Dracula initially appears old when Jonathan first meets him. He then appears young when he's in London. But Dracula doesn't actually appear much in kind of human form. He's seen frequently flapping around at Lucy's and later Mina's window as a bat. We don't get much from Lucy's point of view. She tends to be unconscious when he's attacking her. And then when Mina is attacked by Dracula, everybody walks in on them and they can see he looks human, but we get some from Mina's point of view in her diary. But basically he goes from old to young but he's otherwise not attractive. He's got terrifying red eyes. He's very, very pale because obviously it doesn't have enough blood. So that's a repeated element of description. And he's described as terrifying, basically, whenever anybody sees him. Bela Lugosi's Dracula is handsome and suave and sophisticated. He has the actor's own Hungarian accent, which obviously works well enough. Characters from Transylvania, from Romania, not Hungary, but it does the job for 1930s. He says that classic line from the book, "Ah, the children of the night, what music they make," which every Dracula has to say in every version, because it's such a good line, when they hear the wolves howling. But he is coming across as an attractive man, and he is moving in society as well, much more than Dracula in the book. Dracula in the book obviously interacts with Jonathan a lot, and is capable of being sophisticated and talking, with members of the English middle and upper classes. He asks Jonathan to practice his English with him, because obviously it's a second language for him. But he's perfectly capable of interacting with people, but he doesn't very much. He's really mostly seen as a bat. Can't really emphasize enough how much he's a bat in the book, or a mist. Jonathan sees him from a distance when they're in London at one point. He really doesn't interact with the other characters, apart from in that first bit, the first section where he's got Jonathan prisoner in the castle. Obviously, he interacts with Jonathan a lot. And then after that, he really doesn't interact with anybody else in the cast very much at all. Bela Lugosi's Dracula, on the other hand, is interacting with everybody. He's meeting them at the theatre. They're having conversations. They know him. And Lucy expresses an interest in him. She thinks he's attractive. She's also kind of morbidly interested in death, as luck would have it. And then he does appear as a bat at the window. There's a lot of very iffy puppet bats in this film. And he attacks Lucy, and then Lucy is immediately dead. There's a reference to her having had lots of blood transfusions, and then she's just died. The English language version of this film is only 1 hour and 15 minutes long, so it's a very abbreviated version of what was a long novel. Mina is then similar to the book in the sense that she thinks it's a dream at first when Dracula first attacks her. She goes into trances. Waking Mina has no interest in Dracula. She's being manipulated by Dracula and he's putting her into a trance and so on. But she doesn't have the action and agency of her character in the book. Mina in the book is incredibly important because she's the one who brings everybody together, who types everything up. So they have records of everything and they can cross-check information and they can compare notes, literally compare notes and so on. Whereas in this version, Mina really doesn't do anything other than kind of get attacked by Dracula. They mention the fight for her soul and wanting to make sure that they can recover Mina's soul. She has some of the lines from the book where she talks about feeling unclean after Dracula has attacked her. She says at one point to Jonathan that their relationship is over, but it's because of her guilt about what's happened with Dracula. So there's obvious implications going on there, but you don't kind of see very much. Basically, she has elements of the character of Mina from the book in the sense of the way she's victimized, but she's lost all of Mina's action and agency. And the end of the film is incredibly anticlimactic. Dracula pushes Renfield down the stairs because he thinks Renfield has betrayed him, which sort of similar in the book. He murders Renfield in Renfield's cell in the mental hospital because Renfield has betrayed him to the others. And then they rescue Mina and Van Helsing just stakes him, and that's it. That's the end. There's almost no music, certainly in the version I watched, which was black and white, English language. There are various, the Spanish language version is longer and has a bunch of scenes that got cut from the English language version. This version has almost no music, apart from using Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake at the beginning, which was quite effective. That was kind of a nice touch. And then, yeah, he just kind of stakes the coffin. There isn't even any blood or anything, and then it just stops. I have to confess I was a bit underwhelmed. I don't think it's a bad film. It's a horror classic for a reason. Some of the imagery is very striking, although maybe not as striking as Nosferatu from a few years earlier. Lugosi's Dracula is clearly very important to the development of Dracula as a character. I think that's the big thing that comes from this film. is Dracula as a character who interacts with the other characters. Dracula as a focal character for the story, as a really kind of major force in the story, interacting with everybody else, as opposed to Dracula as a largely unseen force. The book is really structured a lot more like a mystery. That's something I noticed in this film. Very, very early on at the beginning, one of the locals, when Renfield arrives in Transylvania, starts talking about vampires. Outright, he starts talking about vampires and explaining vampires. In the book, it's a very slow build to working out that that's what Dracula is. It's written like a mystery. You know, Lucy has this weird disease. Okay, you've got the section with Jonathan at the beginning. So the reader knows that Dracula's a vampire, but the characters don't know that. They don't know until Mina gets them together. They don't know anything that's happened to Jonathan. And they're treating it like a mystery that Lucy has this mysterious illness that they cannot work out what's wrong with her. And it takes them ages to work out that it's a vampire. The movie is much more, hey, vampires, here's the vampire, here's what he's doing, oh, now he's dead. So, yeah, it's very important to the history of horror movies and Gothic horror, and I certainly would never call it a bad movie. It didn't blow me away. I would kind of rather go and watch Nosferatu again, which I think was a bit scarier, actually, and more visually interesting, possibly because as a silent film it had to be. Then we have the first Hammer horror film about Dracula, retitled Horror of Dracula in the States to avoid confusion with the 1931 film, but also just called Dracula. This film stars Peter Cushing as Van Helsing and Christopher Lee as Dracula, along with Michael Gough as Arthur Holmwood, because the characters have been switched and changed about again. So this one is not a million miles from the plot of the novel, but a bit further from it than the 1931 version or the 1992 version. In this version, Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania as usual, but his stated reason for doing so is to organise Dracula's library rather than to sell him Carfax Abbey. And his actual reason for doing so is that he is a vampire hunter. So in this version, not only is Van Helsing already a vampire hunter, this is his thing, he hunts vampires, he's trying to hunt down vampires, so is Harker. Harker then, also somewhat surprisingly to me, gets killed off, which I was watching it, I was like, wait, did they just kill Jonathan? The relationships have all been moved around again. In this version, Lucy was Harker's fiancée, and she's called Lucy Holmwood. Arthur Holmwood is not her fiancé, but her brother, and Mina is her sister-in-law, Arthur's wife. They also aren't even English, they're German in this one, despite the fact nobody has a German name, because they have names of characters from the novel, even though they are completely different sets of relationships. And once again, Quincy has been written out, and Dr. Seward has a smaller role. In the 1931 version, the action all finished at Carfax Abbey. That's where Dracula was killed. In this version, there is a rush back to Dracula's castle, and he actually tries to bury Mina alive at the end to try and hasten her turning into a vampire, which is a new detail. This version also has Dracula killed by sunlight. Van Helsing drives him into the sunlight, but that's what kills him. And this, of course, is not part of the original novel. In the original novel, Dracula is less powerful in the daytime. Sunrise and sunset is a big deal because Van Helsing has this whole list of powers that Dracula has, including turning into mist and turning into bats and hypnotism and trances and all sorts of things, but he's much, much less powerful during the day. But sunlight doesn't hurt him. He also has to sleep. He has to go back to his native soil, which he achieves by having boxes of earth carried around with him, and sleep during the day. But he can be up and about in the daytime. It's not impossible. He can move around in the day if he needs to. He's not harmed directly by sunlight. This is something that again comes from Nosferatu, where Count Orlok is killed by sunlight. And that then gets attached to Dracula, which is unsurprising given that Nosferatu is an unlicensed version of Dracula. So here Dracula is actually killed by sunlight in Castle Dracula, but they've only had to go from Germany. They haven't had to cross water to get there. The thing that really struck me in this movie was the characterisation of Lucy, which was, I mean, it's very 50s. It was odd. It's very odd. She's initially depicted very childlike. She's clearly old enough to be engaged, but of course that could mean 16, 17 years old. And she's first seen with pigtails. So she's really coming across as extremely childlike, with her brother and older married sister-in-law kind of looking after her because she's unwell. Then it turns out that she has been inviting Dracula in. She has been deliberately opening the window, and when they try and protect her by putting garlic flowers around her and all of that, like they do in the book, rather than her mother, who is adapted out of every version, rather than the mother not knowing what it's there for and getting rid of it, Lucy orders the maid to get rid of it, and she welcomes Dracula in. And this is a major difference because this is waking, conscious Lucy. In the book, she does pull off the garlic flowers while in a kind of trance, but not during the day, not when she's awake and conscious and herself. Whereas in this film, she's pretending to be very innocent and naive while her brother and sister-in-law are in the room, and then she is actively inviting Dracula in and removing all the flowers, or having the servants remove all the flowers. It makes her more active, she has more agency, but it also introduces this idea of her wanting the vampire. Christopher Lee's Dracula, like Bela Lugosi's, is handsome. He, interestingly, is played very much like a kind of English accented British noble, even though nobody's British in this version, even though it's an English film. Actually, technically, they're all German, Dutch, or Romanian. He speaks with an upper-class English accent. He is kind of quite brusque, more normal seeming when Harker first talks to him. He behaves more like a kind of regular member of the aristocracy, so similar to Bela Lugosi's, but even more so. But then he's like completely all-out, blood-dripping fangs vampire when the time comes to be a vampire. And this was the first vampire film made in colour, and boy oh boy are they excited to show you the colour. There's red blood spattering all over the place. This is another one that I know is a classic. It wasn't for me. It feels so cheesy. Some of that is just the taste of filmmaking at the time, but also I didn't really like what they'd done with the female characters. Mina is once again more similar to her book character, but just no agency. Her active part in the story is taken away. And then Lucy is this weird kind of mix of childlikeness and then this inviting Dracula in kind of sexual thing. Yeah, I didn't like what they did with Lucy's character in this film at all. She does look quite freaky when she becomes a vampire, and one nice thing they did was give the child she attacks a name and a character. Tanya, the daughter of the housekeeper Gerda, is an actual character, whereas in other versions Lucy is attacking generic children. In fact, in the book, numerous times they refer to some of her victims as it. They're careful to state that they all survive. The only child that dies is the poor baby that gets fed to the brides in Romania. The children that Lucy attacks all survive, but several times they're referred to as it. They're very young children, and in the 1890s that makes them kind of genderless. A couple of times they're referred to as he, a couple of her victims, or just it. They're just the children. In the 1992 one, similarly, she has a very, very young child, younger again than in the book, where they are old enough to describe her as a bloofer lady, a beautiful lady. The 1990s one, she has an extremely young child, and you can't tell what gender the child is, and the point is just to save the child. This one gives Tanya a name and a personality and a place in the household, and she refers to her as Aunt Lucy, and Lucy says, come and play with me, and that I liked. That scene I did like. That was pretty creepy. It was well done, and it was more effective for actually knowing Tanya and for Lucy having that relationship with her. That means she can lure her away, and it was quite creepy, come and play with me, do you want to come play with me? So I liked that bit. That was very well done, although again, fangs and dripping red blood when she is then staked were a bit interesting. The depiction of the brides was interesting as well. There's only one bride in this version. She is killed early on by Harker because Harker is in this version a vampire hunter. It did include the detail from the book that when she's staked, her body goes old. It didn't quite crumble into dust, but it did turn into that of an old woman, which was a nice touch. But her costume is bizarre. It looks like a 50s or 60s rendition of a Greek or Roman goddess. I don't know if it's meant to imply that she's actually Greek or Roman, like she's that old, but Dracula's not usually implied to be quite that old. Obviously in the novel he was specifically connected to a medieval prince who fought the Turks. It's not usually implied that Dracula's as old as all that, and it was just a very odd costuming choice. It's like, why is she dressed like a 1950s idea of a Greek goddess? Just looked a bit weird. So again, I understand that this is a classic. And, Christopher Lee is very good. In this version, Van Helsing is very much the protagonist. Obviously, there's that issue of who is actually the protagonist of this story. And in this version, it's definitely Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing, who is the hero. It takes him a while to turn up because Harker is there first. But it's definitely Van Helsing is the hero character, the lead character. And he uses Harker's diary, which is given to him by a maid at a local tavern because Harker has been killed off. He is the hero who eventually dispatches Dracula by forcing him into sunlight. And Dracula's death scene was pretty cool as well. I mean, the crumbling into dust was very well done. I did rather like there was a final shot of Dracula's ring sitting next to the ancient Greek word estin, which means he, she, or it is. It's part of a longer quotation. The full quotation is actually from the Odyssey, the epic poem about the adventures of Odysseus. The mind of men who live on the earth is such as the day the father of gods and men, which is Zeus, brings upon them. And there is also a quotation in Latin, but it's actually a Latin translation of Hesiod, who's also Greek writer, similar period to Homer. And earth first bore starry heaven, equal to herself, to cover her on every side, and to be an ever sure abiding place for the blessed gods. And the ring is left on the word estin. He, she, or it is, which was kind of a nice touch. It had that kind of classic horror movie feel of, like, he still is. Even though we've just watched Dracula crumble away to dust, the ring is there on the word he is. I liked that. I liked the ending. So there's stuff I like about this film. But again, the depiction of the female characters just bugs me, especially the depiction of Lucy, which is so far from her book counterpart. And all of the relationships are all mixed up, and the ensemble is gone in favour of Van Helsing as hero. And then the last one I'm going to talk about today, the 1992 film directed by Francis Ford Coppola and starring Gary Oldman as Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula. This film was marketed and sold as being closer to the book. And it is closer to the book than the other two that I've talked about, the Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee versions that are a couple of the best known versions. It has the characters from the book in the same relationship. So it gets rid of very minor characters like Lucy's mother and Jonathan's boss, but it keeps all three of Lucy's suitors. It keeps everybody's relationships the same way that they are in the book. And for the most part, the plot beats of the film do follow the plot beats of the book. However, its big changes are to the characters of Mina and Dracula, and to a lesser extent, Lucy. So Mina has recovered a lot of her agency. She has her typewriter, she is typing up her notes. She has got some of that agency back. She is involved in the climax, but it's changed so that Mina has this love story with Dracula, which seems to have been imported from the 1932 film, The Mummy. So in this 1932 film, there was this whole story about how the mummy was trying to resurrect his dead wife or lover from ancient Egypt, who he believed had been reincarnated in the body of a modern woman. Now, you might be more familiar with this from the brilliant 1999 version, which obviously hadn't been made when the 1992 Dracula was made. But the 1932 version has that story as well. So they seem to have imported that story. They've gone for Vlad III as Dracula. They've suggested that he had only one wife, which isn't quite true. He had more than one wife, but they've gone with his first wife, Elisabetta, who committed suicide. And then they've had Mina be the possible reincarnation of Elisabetta, or at the very least, she looks very like her. And Mina falls in love with Dracula. And the first time I watched it, I hadn't read the book. And I love this film. I really enjoyed it. And I still like it. I'm annoyed with it now that I've read the book, but I do still enjoy the film. It's got a great cast. I have been a defender of Keanu Reeves for many, many years, and the internet seems to have caught up with me these days, and he's very popular. But there was a long time in the 90s and the noughties when Keanu Reeves was constantly being talked down. People were constantly complaining he couldn't act, which isn't true. He has a tendency to be typecast in very particular roles, and his English accent is definitely iffy. So is Winona Ryder's as Mina. But he can act. It is a choice to play a lot of these roles in this kind of slightly deadened way. He is perfectly capable of being lively when needed, as in the Bill and Ted films. I like him. I've always liked Keanu Reeves. I spent many, many years defending my love of Keanu Reeves, and now I think everyone else has caught up with me. So yeah, I love the movie, and it's a good film. It's nice seeing the full cast of characters. It's nice seeing Quincy and Arthur and Seward, and they've all proposed to Lucy. But in this version, Mina is cheating on Jonathan. She is already engaged to Jonathan. She gets married to him halfway through, as she does in the book, and she is cheating on him with Dracula. And she falls in love with Dracula, and towards the end, she doesn't want them to kill Dracula, and it finishes with her ending up finishing him off, having already been attacked by Jonathan and by Quincy. Quincy has, as in the book, died in the process, but in the book, Quincy dies saving Mina's soul and getting rid of Dracula, whereas in this version it's Mina who finally gets rid of Dracula and she loves him, and it's very odd. Lucy's character has been changed as well. Lucy here is extremely flirtatious. It's implied that she has 3 men wanting to marry her, partly because she's rich, but because she's very flirty and she's almost leading them all on. Just adding a very, very quick editor's note just to say I am not trying to suggest there's anything wrong with being flirtatious. I have been flirtatious many times in my life. I very much enjoyed a good flirt back in the day. I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with being flirty. It's more that the implication of the film is that she is knowingly toying with these men's emotions. They are very serious about her. They want to marry her, and she's kind of playing with them. That was what I didn't like, rather than just the flirtiness by itself. Lucy in the book wasn't like that. She was just really nice and rich. And that's why 3 different men wanted to marry her, and Van Helsing fell for her a bit as well. Whereas in this film, there's definitely an implication that she's kind of leading them on. There's a random kiss between Lucy and Mina at one point, which has nothing to do with the book. I guess maybe it's a shout out to Carmilla, which is about lesbian vampires, but that's a stretch. And then Lucy is heavily sexualized, and her encounters with Dracula are, I mean, there is that implication already in the novel about Lucy's encounters with Dracula and Mina's later. They are kind of depicted in a way that is clearly meant to be sexual assault, but they are assault in the book. Maybe using a trance, but that is what they are. Whereas here, it's somewhere in between. Lucy's not quite calling to Dracula in the same way that she does in the 58 film. She's not quite as kind of complicit as all of that. And she does sleepwalk, and he does originally kind of get to her when she's sleepwalking, as in the book, albeit in the garden, not on the cliffs at Whitby. But she's very, very sexualized. The whole thing is very, very sexualized. It's kind of taking the route of Lucy in the book, but not having that split. And I suppose in a way, the changes to Lucy's character feel more like they do come from the book, but exaggerated. I think I was just annoyed at the implication that the only reason she had 3 suitors was because she was flirty and leading them on a bit. Whereas that's not why everybody loved her in the book. She was just really nice. But Lucy's story is a little bit more of an exaggeration and a kind of taking what's in the book and making more of it. It's Mina and Dracula's story that's really completely off page. There's also stuff like blood flying into the room when Lucy dies, which made me think of The Shining, which of course isn't in the book of The Shining, is in the film of The Shining, and isn't in the book of Dracula. There is a lot of blood everywhere in the book of Dracula, but it's coming out of mouths and wounds and so on, rather than out of the walls. So that was interesting. Basically, overall, I love that this has more of the book. I love that it has the characters, but it still doesn't feel like an ensemble the way the book does. This movie really takes Mina as its protagonist, which makes sense. Of the characters in the book, if you're trying to pick one to be your main character, Mina makes sense as the main character. But then it makes her a cheater who's going off with this prince who seems to love Dracula more than Jonathan. In the book, Mina loves Jonathan and Lucy loves Arthur, and there's no question about that. And making Mina in love with Dracula, and then Dracula is this tragic character. There's definitely a heavy Anne Rice influence, I think, on Dracula in this movie. As I said, the book isn't really that interested in Dracula as a character. Van Helsing is interested in his history, particularly the fact that when he was alive, he was very intelligent, and he has carried some of that intelligence through, although there's a whole thing about him having a criminal child brain that's rooted in 19th century criminology that I'm not going to go into now. Basically, yeah, he's taken some of his intelligence and some of his fearsomeness, because he was a warrior, from life into his vampire self. But he is not of primary interest. The relationships of the living characters with each other are the primary interest of the book. The love everyone has for Lucy and the love they'll have for Mina. There's whole scenes establishing Mina, establishing a relationship with Lucy's suitors who she didn't know before, and being like a sister to them and comforting them in a motherly way, because they've all had absolutely horrible trauma visited upon them, especially poor Arthur, whose father conveniently dies to give him a title and lots of money, like around the same time that Lucy and her mother both die. So poor Arthur is in absolute state. A lot of the men spend a lot of time crying, Arthur especially, but John Seward and Van Helsing as well. Poor Arthur spends half the book absolutely in tears, but then he produces his title and a bunch of money to get them where they need to go. So the film it gets closer to that feeling of ensemble, but it doesn't quite get there, because it decides it wants to tell a love story between Mina and Dracula instead, when it should be a love story between Mina and Jonathan. If you are going to pick a love story and have that be the backbone of the story of Dracula, it's Mina and Jonathan's story, with the story of 4 other men and Lucy in the background. And there's all sorts of stuff in the book with the blood transfusions as well, where all 4 men, Van Helsing and the 3 suitors, all give Lucy blood transfusions. And they clearly feel that this is a very intimate act. It's the exchange of bodily fluids. There's not a sensuality exactly, because Lucy's horribly ill and it's a medical operation, but there's a feeling that the blood transfusions are tying them together very strongly. All 4 of these men are tied to Lucy through these blood transfusions, which is an interesting parallel to the vampirism. But it's done with life and love rather than with a desire to take life and evil. The 1992 film does include some lovely touches from the book. It has lots of letters and phonograph diaries and things to replicate the epistolary aspects of the novel. It has Dracula appearing really old when Jonathan first meets him, and then he's young when he turns up in London, which is another detail from the novel. It's got lots of kind of nice, smaller bits and pieces. One of its other odder character choices, though, is Van Helsing. Anthony Hopkins is great, but Van Helsing is kind of accidentally funny in this film, whereas he was actually reasonably witty. In the book, Van Helsing would make jokes sometimes. They all do. There's humour in the book, as in all good books. In the movie, he says things that are funny by accident, and we're more laughing at him than with him, and it's more kind of shocking to everybody. Oh, did Lucy die in much pain? Yeah, and then we cut off her head. It's just a bit odd. And I sounded German rather than Dutch there. But anyway. His characterisation is a bit more mad scientist. He also talks about it being his life's work to fight vampires, which is much more the kind of more modern interpretation of Van Helsing, as opposed to the original, who was a kind of metaphysician doctor philosopher who was just generally interested in the world, and that's how he happened to know something about vampires and was able to work out what was going on with Lucy. So I still love the 1992 movie, but I can't love it quite as much as I used to, having read the book and thinking, oh my goodness, wouldn't it be amazing to have a version that follows the plot beats from the novel relatively closely, but that also captures the ensemble from the novel? The feeling of several different characters coming together to defeat an evil because of their love for each other. A love that is a real human love between living humans, and where, you know, fiancés and married couples love each other very, very much, and they want to save each other or save their soul if they can't save their life. And that's at the core of the novel. And it would be nice to see a version that emphasised that a bit more. So those are my thoughts on some of the best known versions of the story of Dracula. What do you think? I know there's loads more I could have talked about. My videos always end up too long, and I'm really trying to keep them to a sensible length. But if you are interested in more videos about Dracula and vampires, please let me know. I was really surprised how much more I enjoyed the characters, and especially the female characters, in the 1897 original novel than the 3 screen adaptations. They're all written by men, directed by men, but that includes Bram Stoker. He did it way better in the 1890s. Give the programme, people. Anyway, there's millions more versions of Dracula I can look at if people would be interested, and there's loads more I could say about each one of these, but the camera keeps overheating. It's the hottest day of the year. I have to stop. Which is your favourite? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. If you'd like to support the channel, please do consider buying one of my books, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece and Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, available from Amazon, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, Apple, Fable, all the places. Also, the big news this month is I've got merch. So, I don't know, how well can you see my t-shirt? Ooh, hit the microphone. On this camera angle, I have Creepy Classics merch now. This is for sale at my new website, JulietHarrisson.co.uk. That's Juliet, 2 T's, 2 E's, Harrison, 2 R's, 2 S's. It is a pain, I'm sorry. I will link it below. I've got mugs. I've got this lovely latte mug. Got my iced matcha latte in here, keeping it nice and cool while I spend hours and hours and hours recording this because the camera keeps overheating and I keep having to stop. When the weather eventually cools down again, I've got hoodies. So some of the designs just have little ghosts on them. Some of them have the Creepy Classics. I hit the microphone again, sorry. Some of them have the Creepy Classics logo. My new logo that my friend Jess kindly digitised for me that I designed myself. But some of them, I've got some t-shirts and hoodies with just this little spooky historical ghost design. I can show the camera. That's Greek ghost, Roman ghost, Viking ghost. And I know that the horns are historically iffy, but you've got to have something that says Viking to people. If you would like to stock up for Halloween on some cute, spooky merchandise, or if you'd like to support the channel, then please do head on over there. There's a sticker as well if you just want to get something small. And if you do end up buying any of the merch or either of the books, then thank you so much, because it all really helps me to keep going with this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye! Hey Loki Bub, it's too hot for walkies. It's too hot. Maybe later tonight. I know, that's a weird noise. I know, I hope it stops in a minute. There we go. Gonna run around the garden for a minute. No? Too hot? Going back in the house? Shh, you're probably right.